panel. I'm going to turn the stage over to Matthew Savary again. If he and his panelists would turn on their microphones and videos, please. I'm very excited to hear what this panel is going to tell us about Beyond Philanthropy, business models for successfully serving the underserved. Matthew, please take it away.
Sure, of course. So thank you for that handoff, Dina. What I wanted to do with this next several minutes that we have ahead of us is take a light pivot from the kind of elevated conversations that we've been having the previous several hours to talk about a slightly different domain within the medtech arena, and that's in developing medical devices for underserved populations. And I think that was actually something that somebody touched on in the very first session that we had today, asking about how to develop, how to finance business models for those underserved populations. And that's the focus that I wanted to take for these next several hours. And so graciously this afternoon, my guests have agreed to join me, and I'll just introduce them and then have them introduce themselves. To my, well, I guess not, I can't really say to my right, but here on the screen with me, I have Josh Vose. Josh, why don't you introduce yourself on the World Hernia Project?
Sure. My name is Josh Vose. I'm a physician by training. I'm the founder and CEO of the World Hernia Project. You can find us online at worldherniaproject.com. We source and supply surgical mesh for groin hernia repair worldwide at a price that's affordable for individuals and care providers in low and middle income countries.
And this is Dorothy Goldman.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It's really an honor to come here all the way from New York and not have to be on a plane. My name's Dorothy Goldman, and I'm the CEO of Oratel Diagnostics, and we are developing a non-invasive saliva-based diagnostic for endometriosis, which currently has the alternative of a laparoscopy, which costs several $1,000s. And we're meeting the needs of adolescents who are very much underserved in their when they have conditions with pelvic pain. So we would have a screening test that's affordable and accessible to that population that normally doesn't get served. And so I have a background as an inventor, and my goal is to meet the medical profession. So a lot to learn yet.
And last but not least, we have Kathryne Cooper.
Hey guys, super stoked to be here. Happy Tuesday for everybody, and happy afternoon for those on Pacific time. I guess cheers to those on the East Coast. It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah.
I am Kathryne Cooper. I am the co-director of CTIP. We are the West Coast Consortium for Technology and Innovation in Pediatrics. Long name. But short story is we are a medtech accelerator here in Los Angeles that invests capital and connections into pediatric medical device innovators. We're a $6.6 million fund, have just shy of 100 portfolio companies in 20 different states here in the US, and all fairly early stage in the ped medtech space. Dorothy is one of our founders, so very excited to see you here. And I will talk a little bit about my background. It's a little bit of medicine, a little bit of business. Went to Stanford, went to medical school, dropped out, do not have an MD like Matthew here. Went to business school, and for the last 3.5 years have been with CTIP as co-director, really leading our strategy, how we source portfolio companies, and what's most important for this panel, how we help them succeed in such a niche space. So,
all right.
Thanks.
So as the panelists have alluded to, we're kind of all over the place. We have a heterogeneous panel here, but what their intersection, what I noticed was that the patient population that they tend to serve are those that tend to be a little bit overlooked by typical business model generation. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on was when we think about developing medical devices, developing therapeutic innovations, there's a little bit of a bifurcation of the way things are developed. There is typical commercial investment for the mass market opportunities, and then there's philanthropy for these smaller opportunities. And these panelists that I brought together today have managed to figure out some techniques for building actual sustainable business models. And so I wanted to dive into their experiences. For the benefit of the panel, for everybody joining us, So please ask your questions as they arise. But just to get things kicked off, I'll just start with Josh. Why don't you tell us a little, Dr. Vose, why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of the World Hernia Project?
Sure. So the World Hernia Project was started in 2016. I think the important history there is really two things that happened simultaneously. Number one, I survived Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was an early stage Hodgkin's patient, and I started business school at MIT. I read a paper that was published in the New England Journal in 2016, a randomized controlled trial of sterilized mosquito netting versus commercial grade mesh for groin hernia repair. And they were shown to be equivalent. And when I dug, I was fascinated by this because, having been in the OR quite a bit, the, hernia mesh is a premium product and it has a very high margin. It retails for hundreds of dollars per unit and has been around for a very long time. Some of the earliest synthetic meshes go back to the 60s. And so you would think that that individuals in low and middle income countries would not be forced to pay such a premium or be denied access. But that was the reality of the situation, that surgeons that would either travel to those countries to help the population or surgeons that lived in those countries simply didn't have access to a product based on price. And so in the wake of, going through, a major life event and being given some new tools and thinking in business school, I said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so what I set about trying to solve was, could you create a business on selling mesh for $2 per unit, which was the median income in these low and middle income countries? That's actually the dividing line between a low income country and a middle income country. And I got pretty close. I got it down to about $7, and that's with enough margin to sustain the business and the operations, exclusive of shipping. But shipping, you can literally ship things anywhere in the world now, and mesh is very lightweight and easy to pack and send. So it became an operations and business development problem. Can you source it? Can you find the right type of mesh? Can you keep the price low enough and the operations low enough to be able to meet demand?
Okay. So you'd say in your circumstance, you kind of started with the business model and worked backwards from there.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I didn't have to. I started first with thinking, do I need to go and reinvent the wheel? And the answer was no, because there was actually quite a bit of capacity in the system on the manufacturing side. There were manufacturers who were producing mesh that were selling it. And it was equivalent to commercial grade mesh. It was simply a question of finding those suppliers, creating an arrangement with them to be able to customize the product enough to meet the demands of the population. So I didn't need to reinvent the wheel. I needed to reinvent the business.
Dorothy, I understand that you had a little bit of a different history of coming to your discovery. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of your business?
Yeah, Matt. So my background, I actually have a background in biology, but rather than going on the academic track, I changed course and joined the Peace Corps way back in the 60s. And I always had a passion for science and learning. And in working in a small village in Nepal, I learned how to use locally available materials to teach basic concepts in science. And this led to playing around with new materials, which included pigments from plants. And we kept doing different experiments, and I started running a class called Cooking and Chemistry. And we started testing our saliva, and by accident, we noticed these color changes that related to the menstrual cycle. And there were, after many years, when I came back from the Peace Corps and was raising a family, my neighborhood friends started using this. And it was used they used it to actually plan their families. And so in the neighborhood, there were some women who were having difficulty getting pregnant. And when they tested with this test, it was completely different. And I thought, well, it's a test I made. It's not very good. But it turned out that all of these women had endometriosis. And I thought, well, this is really important because these women took them many years to find out that they had endometriosis. And it was through a laparoscopy that they learned. And I began to think of a simple test with saliva must be important. So I thought all you have to do is go to a university and tell them what you've discovered, and then they'll figure out the rest. But that wasn't the case at all. It took many, many years and lots of knocking on doors and lots of persistence. And what I did was I learned how to align myself with other experts. And I gained a partnership with the Endometriosis Association and with Brigham Women's Hospital, where we've been running studies since 2008. And in 2017, I was awarded a grant with the Bayer Grants for Apps program. And that's where I started learning a little bit about how do you develop the business, how do you partner, and how do you start forming the regulatory path. But we're still in a very, very early stage. And this last, in 2020, I think it was, 19, CTIP awarded us a grant to do a further clinical study at Brigham Women's. And because of COVID, we were delayed a little bit in 2020, but now we're halfway through it. And the other thing that's happened is that I joined forces with a company in Europe, in Norway, and we have joined together because they have background in scaling up the production of diagnostics and in the pigments that we use. And we are doing right now we're developing a product that actually has to do with cows and the dairy business. And we've already started manufacturing our product line there, but that's kind of the guinea pig for what we plan to develop with endometriosis. So what's happened in my business model is that I partnered with a company that already has experience in developing diagnostics, and we're working together to make this scalable and commercially available.
Okay. Your experience has a lot to speak about. One of the topics that I'm really interested in is partnering with external stakeholders. Can you talk about working with the Endometriosis Foundation? And then Dr. Vose, maybe you could talk about external stakeholder partnerships that have helped you along the way.
Sure. Yeah. Is that Josh going to start? Yeah.
You can go ahead, Dorothy, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, the very first partner I had was the Endometriosis Association, and it just went like this. To be honest with you, I didn't know what endometriosis was. And there happened to be an article in the Washington Post just at that time about environmental estrogens, and it had the word endometriosis in it. So I called up the editor of the newspaper and introduced myself, and he introduced me to the Endometriosis Association. And they were very curious about what I had developed. And so I sent them some tests, and they liked what they saw and immediately gave me some money to do some more testing, which I had never done in my life before. But that's how it got started. And we just have kept in contact the whole time. And they introduced me to their scientific advisors, who became my mentors. So one of the mentors is at Brigham Women's Hospital, Dr. Stacy Missner. And she and I have been working together since 2008.
Okay. Dr. Vose, what about your experience? I'm sorry.
I also want to say about CTIP that I joined a group called Startup Health, and in there I met Kathryne Cooper, who was very enthusiastic about what I was doing, and amazingly, the support we've gotten from CTIP. We got a grant a couple of years ago, and we also got advice from a company called Cambria about our regulatory situation. And CTIP has been completely open and offered us many opportunities. So as we get to that point, they're there to give us advice and make connections for us.
Thanks, Dorothy.
That's excellent. Dr. Vose, what about your experience with working with external stakeholders?
Yeah, so we've had a couple key stakeholders in our development process. I think the first was with Stanford and some of the faculty there who are major stakeholders in the global surgery community. And when I say global surgery, I mean really more focused on the training and, let's say, curation of surgery in low and middle income countries, resource poor areas or resource disadvantaged areas. So I partnered with a surgeon there who was a friend of a friend who I didn't even know was involved in global surgery. And then one of his colleagues, so George Yang, he was one of our founders. He's now at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And then second, the other major stakeholder in the early stages of this process was the MIT Sloan School of Management. So Sloan has a very strong entrepreneurship program. They provided us with a grant through what's called the Sandbox, which provides some modest funding to help get new business ideas off the ground. They provided mentorship and workspace, really all the basic nuts and bolts, including folks who have done it before, access to individuals who can open your mind up a little bit, as Dorothy mentioned. Those were our primary stakeholders. Later on, as we've grown, we have tried to partner with groups that actually go to these countries. So individuals and organizations who travel to do global surgery work that can help expose new populations to our products.
So, Kathryne, I'm going to turn this question on you. CTIP was kind of born out of a consortium of these kind of stakeholders. Does CTIP have a general theory on stakeholder management and partnership?
Sure. We think, I guess, more stakeholders and partners are better than less. I would describe it as, to elaborate on what Matthew articulated, CTIP is part of the Pediatric Device Consortia program. There are 5 PDCs, or Pediatric Device Consortia. We are all funded by grants from the FDA, and via an act of Congress, the FDA decided to fund more innovation in the pediatric device space. And that's because if you look at the number of pediatric medical devices that have been approved in, let's say, the last decade, it's essentially remained stagnant. So about 24-25% of all devices approved are approved for pediatric use. That means most devices that are used in kids are used off-label. They're approved for general use, which doesn't prohibit them from being used in children, but it means they haven't been specifically tested in them. And so the FDA and the Pediatric Device Consortium want to move that needle. And we want more devices that are specific to peds to be on the market. And how do you do that? You help companies at the early stages with both investment, as Dorothy mentioned, and then connections and, dare I say, partnerships and stakeholders. So if you're an early stage founder like Dorothy, and you don't have a regulatory consulting firm to work with or a strategist or something to the like, CTIP can not only fund those services for you, but we can also help source someone from our partnership network who has experience in pediatrics, who has done great work for our other portfolio companies, and kind of make those perfect matches. In the world of med tech and medical device, CTIP is a small fry, but we're a small fry trying to be a big fry. And the way that we get that is by forming partnerships and collaborations with other folks who are, let's say, higher up the chain. Even doing events like this with the UCLAMEDTECH group, and for Matthew asking CTIP to speak about our work, it helps expand our platform. And this is a partnership. UCLA is part of our consortia. We have 11 organizations, including almost every major children's hospital on the West Coast, that's part of the West Coast Consortium for CTIP specifically. And what that does is that expands the sites we can use for potential pilots, that expands the thought leadership we can tap into for our innovators. More is better in terms of partnerships and stakeholders, but to caveat that, you want to be strategic about what type of value that they can be providing, whether you're a company or an organization like ours. So we keep a detailed list where, this person is an expert on anxiety and depression and really likes working with early stage companies around commercialization. It needs to be as granular as that. So when we have a company that has a very, very specific ask, we can pair them with essentially the best partner, stakeholder, or helper to get them to the next step.
So we kind of dove down into the granular levels a little bit early. We didn't really get an opportunity to talk about specifically the verticals and the patient populations that you're serving. So you kind of talked, you jumped off pretty well talking about how CTIP fits into the greater ecosystem of developing medical devices for pediatrics. Do you mind getting us kicked off just by talking about pediatrics and the specific challenges for developing for that patient population, Kathryne?
Sure. So, fun surprise, kids aren't just tiny adults. They have physiologic challenges, developmental challenges. The stent that you put in a 2-month-old is not the same stent that you would put in a 65-year-old. Kids grow and move. And so there are different hurdles in developing for that space. But there are distinct advantages for developing specifically for that space and giving kids and children kind of the best care that they need. So I think we'll kind of stop there.
Dorothy, I know that you're technically a little bit new to endometriosis in that patient population, but can you tell us a little bit about how they've managed to be neglected as a population?
Oh, yeah. That's not hard. So if endometriosis sounds like a very complicated name, but actually it's a condition that affects 10% of all women. And in that group, there's a group of 6 million who are the teenagers. And in that group, about 40% of them are girls that don't have funds for getting treated. So they end up in the emergency room. And that comprises about 40% of all visits to the emergency room for chronic pelvic pain are from a population that's underserved and that lacks access to education about endometriosis. And they have this pain and go to the emergency room repeatedly. And each time the cost, I think per year, is about $4,000. So if you have 15,000 visits, that's quite a load on the emergency room costs, and you have no outcome. That's the problem, because in order to diagnose endometriosis, which is the growth of a benign tumor in different parts of your body that is made from cells that are like the cells in the uterus, and they can form sort of cysts and blood vessels and nerve connections that make it very, very painful. And this condition is now classically diagnosed with laparoscopy. It actually, what it is, people still don't completely understand, but it may have something to do with stem cells and the interaction of hormones like estrogen. So our technology can alleviate this divide between the patients that can't get to treatment by introducing a non-invasive diagnostic, which is affordable and easy to use, and connect these patients to experts who can then treat them through a virtual platform.
I'd like to pivot off a little bit what Dorothy mentioned in the context of CTIP. So we get this question a lot, specifically when I talk about Oratel, where they think, how is a saliva test for endometriosis a pediatric medical device? So PEDS per the FDA is defined as birth to age 21. And as Dorothy mentioned, there are a significant number of teenagers with endometriosis who are underserved and underdiagnosed and think that this level of pain is normal. So endometriosis affects women of childbearing age, 12 to 42. So that's 12 to 21. That's a big gap there that CTIP felt very, very comfortable in terms of supporting this project and supporting this population within women's health and within the subset of pediatrics. So you really need to think, I think, broadly when you think of what is underserved. A lot of times when you think of peds, you think of babies or very, very little kids, but it can be a 15-year-old, it can be a 17-year-old, it can be someone up to age 21. And to expand on my earlier point about the number of medical devices that are approved for the pediatric population, if you look at the age groups The majority of those are actually approved for transitional adults who are 18 to 21, and there's very little innovation and therefore impact on the younger folks, whether that be neonates, newborns, toddlers, or teenagers. And so a solution like Dorothy's is really great for that very unique subset and can have an incredible impact on those patients' lives.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that really our innovation has more to do with bringing together the parts that don't fit right now in the infrastructure. In other words, the way it works right now is if somebody has endometriosis, they should go to a surgeon or a hospital that can do a laparoscopy. But there's a whole set of population that's left out because they don't have financial access to those services. And they then tax the emergency room and they can't afford it. And so what's happening is it's burdening the cost of the healthcare all over the country. And by introducing this innovation, we can bring those links together and mitigate the costs in the emergency room. So our device, we can actually make it for pennies and sell it for dollars. And that's a huge saving in the health service. And the other thing I wanted to add is that we have a population of 9-year-olds in our study right now. So,
even younger than we. Great.
Yeah.
And Dr. Vose, I know that you were focusing on sub-Saharan Africa and developing markets. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, so the underserved population generally with groin hernias is places, folks that live where manual labor is the card of the land. I think most people would be surprised to learn that groin hernia actually has a greater disability burden than malaria, because people can work when they have malaria. When you have a groin hernia, it just gets worse and worse over time until ultimately folks are debilitated. The way hernias are repaired presently is just with oversewing, so suture darning basically of the hernia. And this, groin hernia occurs in 10% of the population in men. It's about a third of that in women. And so 50% of the ones that are repaired with suture alone will recur. And so as folks are natively occurring, you're only solving about half of them. And so the disability burden just keeps growing and growing over time effectively. And so the only way to fix this is with mesh, and mesh drops the recurrence rate to the low single digits. So when you think about the underserved population, it's really anyone who can't pay for the mesh. And that was the problem that we were trying to solve, was simply access based on price, and trying to reach out to the surgeons who do the repairs to make it known to the patients who are seeking a repair that there's a way to solve this in a long-term fashion instead of basically flipping a coin to see if you're going to come back and need another repair.
So touching on to a point that Dorothy actually started exploring, I'll start with you, Josh. How did you start making the economic story make sense? Or how did you make,
Yeah, a lot of spreadsheet time, to be honest. Well, first I had to build the business model, frankly. I had to see if I could really model it out and then see if I and the people I work with could stick to the model to control the costs, right? And then you have to go to the place where you're selling this and do the primary research on pricing and ethnography and see if people would be willing to pay the amount and see if they can afford it to actually make the business work. And so what started with a spreadsheet exercise and a lot of estimations really got put to the fire when I traveled to West Africa. I met with quite a number of surgeons and individuals to interview them and find out how they access medical products, how they pay for them, what their pricing flexibility is, and then ultimately trying to see if this would appeal to people. I think one of the early issues that you struggle with is something called price quality signaling, such that if your if your product is priced too low, people will think it's of poor quality. And this is a very real thing. It's why we pay premiums, pay too much for things that really cost quite a bit less than they retail for. It's because we're willing to pay for it and we assign quality to these things. And so if you're selling something that's inexpensive or affordable for many people, how do you still imply or convey that it is of the same quality as a product that is sold for, nearly 2 orders of magnitude more? That was one of the biggest challenges we had. And you have to provide samples, which obviously incur costs. You have to build that into the model. You have to get people to try the product and see that it works, and then ultimately create some evangelists.
With that business model, because we both, backstory for everybody on the call, both Dr. Vose and I used to work for Medtronic. And Medtronic is a very sales staff heavy model. So that's actually how we get things wherever they're supposed to go. Was there any innovation in the actual delivery of the product that you had to do?
No, no, thankfully, because your everyday shipping carriers literally can get a product to almost any part of the world within 2 days. And so using DHL, using FedEx, using even the United Parcel Service, you can put a product in the mail and get it where it needs to be. And something as light as hernia mesh can be sent. You can send quite a number of units just in a letter envelope, which is really quite easy to do. One of the things I found in the ethnography research was that one of the reasons why folks could not access, why native populations could not access commercial grade hernia mesh was because the larger strategic medtechs had decided not to sell in those countries because they couldn't support they couldn't sell it at a high enough premium to support having a sales team there. When internet commerce is, has been around for over, 25 years now, since back in the days when I was in high school, and shipping even longer than that you can both purchase and provide these things in a fully automated way to get people the products they need.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to interject about DHL as well. We've been sending products not for the endometriosis, but for our cow products since COVID began surfacing to New Zealand. And we thought initially, all this started just as COVID was starting. And we thought, what's going to happen? And we said, we can do this because we do have the internet and because we do have DHL. And the problem is that you don't always get your deliveries exactly when you want them on time. So you have to plan ahead. So we've learned because initially we just said, oh, we'll just send a couple hundred. And then all of a sudden there was a demand for a couple thousand. And all of a sudden, how are we going to get a couple of thousand there in 2 or 3 days? So you have to think ahead. Your demand may exceed the ability to send it.
Very true. It's not without challenge. I think the point I was trying to make was that it is substantially easier than trying to put boots on the ground, pay for that operational expense as a business of supporting them, and then having them go around and sell a product that people can't even afford.
Dorothy, you were touching on this earlier when you're talking about cost savings for health systems. Is that a conversation that you had to start making when you were building your business model originally?
Yes. First of all, the whole world of diagnostics is always facing a challenge because that's the low cost. What people want to sell are the therapeutics. And so getting the diagnostic in the world, if you want to talk to investors, this is particularly true 20 years ago. I'm a little bit old. People wouldn't talk to you because diagnostics don't bring in the cash that people want. And so you have to make a case that this is a huge saving in the health system, which it is in the case of endometriosis, because most of the endometriosis itself, and if you take the total picture in the U.S. health system, is about $24 billion. And that's including loss of work time and quality of life and the hospital expenses and all the emergency rooms. So making a dent in that, if you have a cheaper system, will be very cost effective.
So I know that you worked with, sorry, I'm pointing doesn't do anything. But Dorothy, I know that you worked with a strategic investor, but when you were trying to make that health economic story, what did that look like? What did those conversations look like?
Well, the first conversation was when we were talking to a potential investor, is that their interest was the therapy, and they needed a way to get there. And the only way to get there is because they can't give the therapy unless it gets approval as to be diagnosed. So they needed a diagnostic, and you can't reach the population that you're reaching with a $2,000 diagnostic. So if you have a diagnostic that costs $20 or $200, it's a bargain. And that's how you get that's how your partner can get into the market. So the partner is dependent on the diagnostic.
Kathryne, with your portfolio companies, have you noticed any challenges to building that economic story for pediatrics?
Yes. So your average investor wants to know, okay, this is interesting for pediatrics, but does this the adult market? Because in their mind, they're seeing kind of dollar signs, and there are more adults than there are kids, and that makes sense to them. So what we look for, or at least encourage our companies to do, is look for some sort of kind of strategic alignment to the system, whether that's reducing, as Dorothy mentioned, healthcare providers' time, or increasing patient satisfaction or safety. Like, what part of not only the economic model from a just dollar perspective, but what part in the healthcare ecosystem chain is your solution solving for, as opposed to just the interaction with the patient. And so we've done help fund a couple kind of health economic and reimbursement studies for our portfolio companies and the like, and each of them ends up with a different answer, but they need a very specific answer when they're speaking to the investment or strategic community of what this does. For example, we have a company called TubeAid that if anyone has had, let's say, cord management, like you can buy these things at IKEA, you want your cords to be like hidden under your desk and stored away. But imagine that you put over someone's hospital bed that hosts IV lines, which are providing life-saving medication to patients and are currently being taped down, added with tongue depressors, and just a mess. And so we focused for them on the health safety and health quality concerns of why would a hospital want to buy this device as opposed to just doing the kind of hack system that they're doing before, because this increases patient safety. It makes it easier for nurses to do line checks, et cetera, which makes clinical time more efficient. And that's just one example that's specific to them, but that's how we kind of think about it.
Oh, I know, got it. So I know that CTIP offers funding, but do you have any general strategic advice for fundraising for pediatrics companies?
Yes. So I would encourage them to explore all non-dilutive capital options before anything else. And so this can involve SBIR grants, STTR grants, NIH grants, funding opportunities like CTIP, where we invest non-dilutive capital in the form of grants, pitch competitions, et cetera. We've had some of our portfolio companies, raise $1-2 million with a federal grant, which is equivalent to some people's seed rounds. And think about that they didn't give up any equity in their company for that. But outside of non-dilutive capital and federal funding, specifically around technology, I'd also encourage them to look at what you can talk about needing mission-aligned investors. So I believe there are a lot of investors on this call, including potential angels and high net worth individuals. And to those folks, I would say, look at the pediatric space because it's not as crowded of a market in terms of people investing early and often at the brink of these companies. And so you won't need to compete with other big firms. You can kind of fund your niche, get really, really good at a certain area, in this case, pediatrics, and then ask people like CTIP if you kind of need help and guidance as to what makes the most sense. And the third thing I would like to mention is with essentially the concept of patient capital, which is what we encourage our companies to go after. And I said patient, meaning like waiting for something, not patient, like being a medical patient. And that's aligning yourself with investors who are really investing for the long term. So with patient capital, an investor is willing to make a financial investment in the business with no expectation of turning a quick profit. So they'll kind of forego an immediate return in terms of looking at substantial returns and impact down the road. And so that gets back to my point of mission-aligned investors, that they're looking at the impact on not only the clinical space, but the investment space. And I apologize because it's Gardner time. And here I am in my office, and you can probably hear the legal outside. So I'm going to mute myself because this is basically worst case Zoom panel scenario.
We made it work until it didn't work. So thank you for that, Kathryne. Josh, I know that you had to think about financing the World Hernia Project a little bit differently. Yeah. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the long version of a short story, or the short version of a long story, is that I have bootstrapped the World Hernia Project. So I've used my own funds and sweat equity to build it. In the early days of the venture, I was offered about $1 million seed at a pretty good valuation, but I decided not to go that route. And the reason why was because I wanted to, at least in the early stages, try and maintain as much control as I could. It was less about the amount of equity. It was really about trying to apply some different thinking to the model than I think that which would come with more traditional routes of financing. At that point. And since then, it for me, it was the right decision. I think to reach the next stage, we're either going to seek out partnerships or potentially venture. But we passed on venture in the early days. And, you do think back and wonder, could we have gone a little bit faster? Could we have gotten a little bit bigger? Could we have reached, more folks quicker? And the answer, of course, is yes. But I think for the long term, the route we chose was the right one.
Dorothy, I know that you got to touch on this earlier, but can you just give us the comprehensive story on financing?
Yeah, well, in my case, it was always risk. I was very reluctant to go and get an early stage investor because I had trouble believing myself. So I wanted to make sure I was standing on solid ground before anybody came in and put their feet in the bucket. So my motive was always, does this work? Does this work? Does this work? And as long as I could move it along and learn and feel confident that it was working, then I was willing to keep going. And what happened was, what I needed more than money was expertise and people who knew how to run a business. So I made a partnership with a company that I got to know through Googling in 2005, that they make the pigments that we use, and they make them at an industrial level. And they had experience in making diagnostics. And we just spent about 10 years getting to know each other. And this last year, we've now partnered. And it's a great partnership because we both are benefiting each other. They know how to manufacture and design and make devices. And I know how to generate ideas and connect to people who can help us. So we're working really well together. And they also have funding because they've exited before, and they had a huge amount of funds that they could put into this business. So right now, everything is funded through them, and we're working very well together.
Well, I want to thank you all for your insights. I'm sure that they were really valuable for both our investor partners and our research scientist developer partners here on the phone. So thank you for joining me this afternoon, and I'm going to hand it back over to Dina.
Oh, Dina, before you go, can I do one plug before I get kicked out of the Zoom?
Absolutely.
CTIP is currently accepting applications for our Catalyzing Pediatric Innovation Flex grants. These are specifically focused on innovators who are addressing health equity issues in the pediatric device space, very much aligned with what we've just discussed today. And those applications are open through March 12th, which is this Friday. So please visit us at westcoastctip.org for more details. And if you do not have a health equity focused pediatric med device, but just a general pediatric med device, our applications for our general grant competition will be open in the next 2 weeks. So catch us on the web, and sorry to cut you off, Dina.
That's all right. Actually, Josh or Dorothy, if either of you want to put a plug for your own stuff, it seems only fair to me.
Dorothy, please go ahead.
What a plug for ourselves. Well, we're not advertising right now. We're still developing. And what I'd like to put a plug for is CTIP, because without them, we wouldn't be here.
That's awesome.
And I really say this sincerely. The support in terms of connecting us and networking with us to mentors and experts that can help is really invaluable. And this just wouldn't happen without support and connections to people who know how to do it better than we do.
On my side, I'll throw a plug to the World Hernia Project. So worldherniaproject.com. You can find us on the web. You can buy hernia. You can buy mesh for hernia repair online, any country, including the US. So hit us up.
Thank you so much, Josh, Kathryne, Dorothy, and Matthew. This was just a fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed it.